I want, first of all, to thank my dear, dear friend, Stephen Hadley. You know how important it is to have people in the trenches with you who share your values and who have your back. And throughout the 8 years that we were together in the Bush administration and the couple of years together in the administration of George H.W. Bush, there was never a more honorable public servant than Stephen Hadley. Stephen, thank you for your service. Congratulations to my co-recipient, Ken Griffin. The list of your philanthropic activities is just remarkable, but I think what we could fill in the citation to you and in the remarks made about you is that you just have a really big heart, and I am so grateful to share the stage with you tonight. Ambassador Woodward, you honor us with your presence and with your remarks about what the Marshall Plan meant. Because I think that for Americans, we know what George C. Marshall meant to us. To hear it from a friend and ally, thank you, and thank you for your marvelous service to democracy while you were in China and now at the United Nations. I'm honored to share the stage with you as well. To Paul Lovingood and to the Fletchers, thank you for your stewardship of this wonderful foundation and for this terrific tasty dinner that we've enjoyed. And to my good friend, Peggy Noonan. You know, I have to tell you that the Wall Street Journal asked me to write a little piece about what it meant to be living through COVID. And I talked about the isolation that one might feel and so forth. But the one thing that I said when asked, what are you reading? I said simply, Peggy Noonan. Peggy, thank you for your grace and thank you for sharing your tremendous talent with us. I am deeply, deeply honored to receive this award, particularly on the 75th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. You know, every day when I went to the State Department as the Secretary of State, I would walk along a corridor that we called Mahogany Row. And along that corridor were the portraits of former Secretaries of State. Some of them who you wouldn't be able to pick out of a lineup of one because they've long since disappeared from our history. A few that you wondered why they were still there, like that horrific portrait of John C. Calhoun, who actually tried to destroy the country. And then I would keep walking, and I would walk into my office where the pride of place was for George C. Marshall's portrait. And I could often stand in front of that portrait and wonder what it might have been like for him and for the people of the State Department in those rather dark days after the end of World War II. We forget that just before Marshall would become Secretary of State, in 1946, the Italian communist would win 48% of the vote, and the French communist, 46% of the vote. The question wasn't, would Eastern Europe be communist? It was, would Western Europe be communist? Of course, Marshall would respond in 1947 by this remarkable idea, an idea of enlightened self-interest, that by rebuilding both friend who had been victorious and foe who had been vanquished, that we would make the world not just safer and better for them, but safer and better for us. Marshall would, of course, go on to face other challenges as Secretary of State. The Berlin crisis of 1948, the coup in Czechoslovakia that would take the last free country into the Soviet bloc in 1948. The outbreak of war in the Middle East. Of course, in 1949, the Soviet Union would explode a nuclear weapon 5 years ahead of schedule. The Chinese Communists would win, and Marshall would be called back to service when the Korean War broke out as Secretary of Defense. Who would have thought that those dark days, who would have thought that the response to those dark days would end in 1989 to 1991, when I was fortunate to be the young Soviet specialist for the White House. It would end in 1989 with the liberation of Eastern Europe, the unification of Germany in 1990 completely and totally on Western terms. In fact, West Germany would emerge the state, the successor state. East Germany would simply disappear. And in 1991, the Soviet Union would collapse. And in 2007, an American president would go to a NATO summit in Latvia. Who would have ever dreamed that in 46 or 47 or 48 or 49 or 50? Maybe not even in 60 or 70 or 80. But you see, because of the wisdom and the strength of Marshall and others like him in those days after World War II, the understanding of enlightened self-interest, the understanding that democracy matters, that compassion matters in the lives of people, the understanding that allies matter. Because of that, we harvested those great decisions in 1989, 1990, and 1991 to help create a Europe whole, free, and at peace. But I have to say that in 1991, we would never have imagined the world in which we live today. A world in which war has returned to Europe. And not just war of the kind that we might have thought, fought somehow in cyberspace or fought somehow with advanced weapons. No, instead, a ground war in Europe in the service of imperial ambitions of a once great power. As we face that world that we could not have imagined in 1991, as we face that world that we now need the kind of leadership that Marshall provided, I would suggest that we look back and we think again on what made it possible for Marshall to do what he did. First and foremost, it was the character of the man. It was also the experience of the man with war, to recognize that out of war could come peace, but an understanding that a peace had to be just. And if a peace was going to be just, it meant that men and women had to live in freedom, because no one deserved to live in tyranny. But to understand that if men and women were to be free and to have the right to choose those who would govern them, they would expect that those who would govern them would also deliver for them. And that was the genius of the Marshall Plan, to allow those democracies to get up off the mat, deliver for their people, and become strong and vital friends of the United States once again. We could do well to remember that today, because in times of crisis, you need to remember where you've been, you need to see where you are, and you need to see who you want to be in the future. And in that regard, Marshall had one other extraordinary characteristic. He believed in the United States of America and its goodness. Today, there are many who question our goodness, and we have made our share of mistakes. But I do believe that, by and large, the United States of America has been a country that has tried to act on enlightened self-interest, really realizing that when others are safe and secure and free, we too are safer, more secure, and freer. That, ladies and gentlemen, is an argument that we are going to have to make over and over and over again to our fellow citizens, because it fades with time, that is the true meaning of security, prosperity, and peace. And as to believing in America, well, yes, our country was born with a birth defect called slavery, and it marks us even to this day. But when we think about who we were, where we are now, and who we want to be, I always try to keep in my mind's eye some moment when I realized how far America had come. And for me, that was the day that I was sworn in as Secretary of State. I stood there in a building that George Marshall had once occupied. I stood there under a portrait of Benjamin Franklin. I stood there to be sworn in, taking an oath of office to a constitution that once counted my ancestors as 3/5 of a man. And I stood there to be sworn in by a Jewish woman Supreme Court Justice, my neighbor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. For 1 minute, I thought, what would old Ben have thought of this? Well, he is my favorite founding father. I would like to think he would have liked it. But in fact, he would never have imagined it. And neither, frankly, would I have imagined it as a little girl growing up in segregated Birmingham, Alabama. And I'm quite sure that Ruth, just trying to get her voice heard in law school, would never have imagined it either. And yet, there is that very special characteristic of the United States of America, that we somehow seem to make the impossible seem inevitable in retrospect. That was the genius of George C. Marshall. It must have seemed impossible in 1947. It must have seemed impossible that friend and foe, flattened by the horrors of World War II, would emerge strong and vibrant pillars of security, prosperity, peace, and freedom. But that impossible did indeed come into being. But what we all need to remember is that actually it is not inevitable. It takes leadership and foresight and creativity. And that is what we celebrate in the 75th anniversary of the Marshall Plan and the legacy of George C. Marshall. Thank you very much.